Thanks for staying with us here on Breakfast Central on a Monday morning. Great way to start your new working week. And of course, to get latest stories from one continent, Africa. Kenyan opposition leader Raila Odinga is always and still is in the news. Well, yesterday he called off demonstrations planned for today in the country and said his party would sit down for dialogue with the government after 2 weeks of protests. The announcement came after President William Ruto urged the opposition to cancel their protest and participate in a bipartisan parliamentary committee to work through their concerns related to last year's elections. Well, let's take a look at what he said.
Our country's image and history in the League of Modern Nations has been at stake in the last 2 weeks. The country's economy has been hit hard at a time when my administration is doing everything possible to salvage the economy from the deep hole where we found it. The violence, chaos, and disorder continues to distract our national focus of economic transformation. 3 Kenyans, among them a police officer, have lost their lives in the protest. More than 400 Kenyans, including at least 60 security officers, have been injured. I urge my brother Raila Odinga and the opposition to call off the demonstrations and to give this bipartisan approach a chance for us to take the country forward.
Well, 3 people have died since Odinga called protesters to the streets for the first time on March 20th, vowing to march every Monday and Thursday until their concerns are met. This morning, we're joined by Daniel Ominde-Okoth. He's the lead editor, Africa Blogging, and he joins us live from Nairobi, Kenya to discuss this even further. Thank you so much for joining us, Daniel.
Thank you for having me on the show.
All right, let's talk about the response. This should have been the 3rd protest, I believe, and what we're seeing now is that it's been called off, right? And temporarily, it would seem. Talk to us about the mood in Kenya after the announcement by President William Ruto. And do you think that Kenyans consider his reaction quick enough?
Well, the mood was that of relief among many Kenyans who, for 2 weeks now, they've not been able to go to work on Mondays and Thursdays. They feared for their businesses in terms of losing revenue as no customers are streaming in, but also the safety of those business enterprises that they run in various cities that were hard hit by the demonstrations, and mostly in Nairobi here at the capital, in Kisumu in the western part of the country, and Nakuru. Those are some of the cities around the country that saw like the hugest branch of these particular demonstrations. But of course, there are also supporters of Mr. Odinga who also felt like there's been talk of them being shortchanged, and they're trying to express anger on social media and lack of distrust for the process. And this is essentially because the main issue that there seems to be consensus on at this point is the reconstitution of the electoral body, that is the Independent Elections and Boundaries Commission. There are other 2 issues that these particular protests were meant to address. First, there was the issue of the cost of living. Of course, there was that issue of the reconstitution of the Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission. And there was the 3rd issue about an independent audit of the servers that were used by the Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission in declaring the results of the last elections. Right now, there's only consensus on one item, and that's where the truth has come in. So this, again, to other pundits, it reflects a position that pundits have held over time, that the protests were not really about the cost of living. They were not really about the common Kenyan. The common Kenyans being used in the protests to show up in the streets were basically just a means to an end. And probably what happened yesterday is just validation of that point of view.
All right. Well, Odinga has continued to accuse Ruto of stealing the presidency, and he considers his government illegitimate. And so far, so good. We've seen him extend an opportunity for a dialogue, as rightly put in that video, most importantly, where he had a press conference as well. But do you think that William Ruto will be more than willing to eventually give room for the server to be checked, just as Odinga has continued to clamor for a check into the servers?
Well, there are things about those demands that we know are not really practical and are also not in the purview of the president to give access to. We have even as the president was making his remarks yesterday, he says these conversations with the oppositions are going to be structured around the existing laws and the constitution. Remember, he said instead of going into direct talks with Mr. Odinga, he said that the teams will select a bipartisan team who will then engage in parliament. When it comes to access to those servers, one, the president and the government do not run elections as an executive. The elections are run by an independent body that has been set forth in our constitution. That independent body is the Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission. It is not the president or the government that run the elections directly. So which means the demand for access to servers has to go through the Independent Elections and Boundaries Commission. Right now, as it is, we don't have an election commission. All the commissioners are out of office after the last elections. 3 retired because their terms had come to an end in January. Another 3 opted to resign because they were facing investigations as a result of parliamentary recommendation on their conduct during that past election. One went through that process and was considered to be unfit for office. So right now we have vacancies in the commission in terms of all 7 commissioners. So there's really no body that's mandated to grant that sort of access that's needed that the opposition were asking for. But even more superior is that as much as Mr. Odinga says that the elections of Mr. Ruto, President Ruto, to be illegitimate, the Constitution of Kenya only provides for one avenue for recourse when it comes to the results or a dispute in the results of the presidential election. That avenue for recourse is the Supreme Court, which it prescribes with very definitive timelines on when such a petition against an election can be lodged, how long it takes to determine, how long it even takes for them to get into into a preliminary hearing, how are the issues in that particular petitions to be framed and adjudicated at a final result given. We went through that process in 2018, not 2018 rather, but 2022, and then at the end of it, we had William Ruto was declared to be validly elected. And then we had a swearing in also as stipulated by the Constitution. So there's no way we can walk back from this. And I don't expect Mr. Ruto to go back and not tell these guys, you know what, here we can now audit the servers. It is not within his mandate. It is not within his purview unless we decide now to change the Constitution. Changing the Constitution again, it is a whole process. I mean, we've been on that road before between 2018 and 2022, we tried to change the constitution. We saw how difficult it is to amend the current constitution that we have.
All right. Let's also talk about freedom of the media. There have been allegations about the press being attacked in this protest. On the one hand, we've heard journalists talk about it's being targeted. President William Ruto has come out to say it's not targeted. But, there have been conversations about it being targeted because they have said that pictures and, photos from the protest will be used to prosecute those who are partaking in the protest. Give us a true picture of what the situation is before we share with you a video that I would like you to react to.
So there are like more than 22 journalists in Kenya who've been assaulted during this protest since the 3 days of protest that we've had in the past 2 weeks. Some sustained really serious injuries, and I mean it's very regrettable. The Media Council has come out and given a strong statement, condemning the attacks. And the attacks were coming from both sides. There were attacks coming from the government, from the police forces against the journalists. We don't know who was directing those attacks, but also there were attacks against journalists that were being perpetrated by protesters. The opposition said those were not protesters, but actually thugs pretending to be protesters and using those opportunities to attack journalists with the aim of stealing their equipment. Mostly cameras and microphones were the main items that were targeted. But it was really regrettable, and I think we need to get to a point where, in terms of protests and conflicts like this, journalists get the same respect and the the same respect that other first responders get. Like when you are in an emergency situation like this, when you see a Kenya Red Cross ambulance, when you see other ambulances coming to site, we see that these people are actually coming to save lives, they're actually coming to protect people. It is the presence of journalists with their cameras in protests such as these ones that actually protect both sides against the excesses of each other. And that's something that I think we need further, trainings or even engagements between parties in a conflict, so that they need to get to a point where they respect journalists, because journalists are there for their own security, like we have other first responders, like ambulance and paramedics during protests like this.
Well, it seems to be very good news, especially for Kenyans, knowing that there will be no mass protest this morning as they wake up to go back to their businesses and maybe schools as well. Like we've said, and like you've rightly mentioned, it's just for a time frame. Hopefully, they don't get back to the protest. But let's take a look at this video where Odinga actually extended the olive branch of what he said. We'll be right back to ask more questions.
In view of the foregoing, we stand down our demonstrations for Monday, that is tomorrow, April 3rd, 2023. But in doing so, we want to emphasize that the right to assemble, to demonstrate, petition, and speak are ironclad as provided for in our Constitution. 7, therefore, we reserve our rights to call for demonstrations should this process not bear fruit. Should there be no meaningful engagement or response from Hon Ruto to our counter offer, we resolve to resume our demonstrations after 1 week.
And of course, that's a speech by Raila Odinga, the leader of the Azimio La Umoja Kenya, One Kenya coalition. But I'd also like you to take a look at a clip that has made the rounds on social media. It's a video of Pastor Dorcas Rigathi Gachagua. She's the wife of the deputy president of Kenya, and she was condemning the protest. So let's have a look at it, and then we'll have your reactions.
And one of them or two were touched. You saw they rose up. They have power, they have means to be able to speak for themselves. I come here to speak for those boys who are out there, the ones who are being abused and those ones who are taking that tear gas, the ones who are killed. Those are my boy children. I've been wanting to turn around, to rehabilitate and cause and to validate their dreams. You and I must validate the dreams of those children. And we must, as Kenyans now, come out clean and make sure that whatever we do is for the progress and advancement for the future generation.
All right, so there she is, kicking against the protests. But let's just leave it with a final question for you, or penultimate one. How can Kenya heal from this back and forth protest? And now that you've also expounded on the fact that the IEBC is not capable of showing Odinga the server, where does Kenya go from here?
I mean, it's good that we've started conversation. Kenya is a very strategic country in terms of when you look at geopolitics. Even the current peace deal that's happening, it is not the works of Mr. Odinga and President Ruto as per se. Last week, we had a very high delegation of representatives from the United States of America. They were part of them were attending the ongoing American Chamber of Commerce summit that was happening in Nairobi. But on the sidelines of that, there were very high-level diplomatic engagements. And these are the same people that were involved in 2018 when we had similar protests between engagements between Mr. Odinga and former President Uhuru Kenyattas. This country is very strategic in the region when it comes to regional peace, when it comes to efforts of the international community, particularly the United States, where the operations in Somalia, the operations in the entire Horn of Africa region, Kenya itself, holds military base for training for both the British Army and the United States of America Army at the coast, and for British Army further in central Kenya. There are a lot of security drills that happen between the Kenyan Army and the Kenyan security agencies when it comes to the fight against terrorism and insurgency in this region. So, and then there are also very many international business interests in Kenya and this region, and Kenya acts as the hub and the entry point for the whole of Eastern Africa, and to some extent, even the landlocked Central African countries. So the location of Kenya is very strategic to the interests of the global community. And that's why for so many years we've seen when Kenya is on the brink of falling into anarchy, the international community comes in and sets up. So we're going to see these engagements continue. I don't think it is up to Mr. Ruto or Mr. Odinga to once in terms of framing what happens next. But I think it is also in the interest of the country. I mean, when the elections happened, people moved forward or moved on until these calls for demonstrations came back, and you can even see. The demonstrations happen in pockets around the city, and we also see we don't have many people trying to get into town as we had seen, for instance, in 2018 and so on and so forth, which means that the population are basically just concerned about their businesses. They want to move forward. They see the politicians also as fighting against their own personal interests rather than their interests, but they're being used as a means towards, a political end. And that the fact that even this particular truce has been called on the political front and on a political issue rather than the common issue, which is the cost of living, quietly shows that the common mwananchi, the common Kenyan citizen, was not really at the fore of what the opposition was fighting for. What do we need going forward? I think our leaders, Kenyans, need to now be more demanding of their leaders. We need to be able to tell our leaders, what to sit on a table whenever they have issues and discuss them. We have a very vibrant legislative environment in legislative and representative environment in parliament, both at the Senate level and at the National Assembly level. But even over and above that, we have very regional assemblies, which we call county assemblies, which are all avenues for discussions and engagement of matters of civil or civic interest that our leaders can engage in. And even over and above that, as principals, as leaders that we look up to, they can set a good examples to us by always calling each other, sitting on the table, because they have each other's phone numbers, they have each other's handlers' phone numbers, and they can get themselves to sit on a table. Because if they cannot reach each other and sit on a table to discuss issues that are pertinent to them or to this country, then what example are they setting for us as Kenyans? We've come a long way. In 2017, this country almost was brought down to the ground. I think Kenyans also made a decision that they are never going to allow themselves to go that way. We are never going to allow ourselves to, rise against each other because of ethnic or political formations. And, our politicians need to continue giving us leadership so that we keep that peace that we promised each other.
Right. Thank you so much for your time. We do hope that, the peace that was promised is being achieved, and that the citizens do not have to bear the brunt of this protest and this clash that some have termed political. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me as always.
Thank you.
All right, let's move away from Kenya. The after effects of Cyclone Freddy continues to affect Mozambicans, as over 184,000 displaced people are currently facing the country's worst cholera outbreak in more than a decade. Reports from the World Health Organization say that over 1 million people face the possibility of contracting cholera, polio, or COVID-19.
Well, according to the WHO World Health Organization representative for Mozambique, Dr. Severine Vonzelander, while cholera outbreaks regularly occur in Mozambique between October and April of every year, with more than 21,000 cases currently and 95 deaths, this is the largest outbreak in the last 20 years. He added that Anika province bordering Zimbabwe had not seen a case of cholera in the last 15 years. But the mid-March cyclone Freddy had damaged 163 health facilities, raising health risks.
8 of the country's 11 provinces have been affected as cases continue to rise. Now recall that the first vaccination campaign was launched back in February, and the new one just kicked off Thursday, March 30th in the eastern city of Kurliming, targeting 410,000 people. This is unfortunate. When there are floods, it's totally expected that we see situations where people will have to deal with the aftermath of flood. Sometimes it's hunger, other times it's displacement and trying to find their homes and where to live and settling. Other times it's the farming and the agriculture is affected, and in this case it's cholera and their health being affected. It's unfortunate. We do hope that some relief is brought to Mozambique. Away from there, let's head to South Sudan, where yesterday they deployed the first batch of soldiers to Goma in the east of the Democratic Republic of Congo. The group of at least 45 soldiers now joins a regional military force in the region racked by the M23 rebellion. The Seven-Nation East African Community EAC military force was created last June and will oversee the withdrawal of M23 fighters from Eastern DRC.
Well, much of the region is plagued by dozens of armed groups, a legacy of regional wars that fled in the 1990s and 2000s. Since re-emerging from dormancy in late 2021, M23 rebels have captured swaths of territory in North Kivu province and advanced within several dozen kilometers of its capital, Goma. So M23 conversation is still on. South Sudan deploying troops to DR Congo. This was a long time planned for, and now it's actually taking place, meaning that hopefully there will be an end to the M23 rebels and the crisis that's surrounding what DR Congo is going through. Don't forget, Rwanda has also been pointed as being a major supporter or major sponsor of the M23 rebels, in which Rwanda government has indeed debunked such rumors, saying never. It's not part of the M23 build-up or the rebels or insurgency that's ongoing there in DR Congo. But we'll keep you abreast with the latest stories concerning that, like we always do, because we're Africa First, and we'll continue to prune, go deep, ask the right questions, and of course find out either through investigative journalists or reports on what the situation is. And we're hoping and likely that before the end of the year, all of these things will have died down in terms of insurgency that's going on over there in DR Congo. But guess what? Breakfast Central continues this morning on the Monday. If you just tuned in, we're saying welcome. You've missed a bit of the action. When we say action, we mean the latest stories surrounding the African continent. But we're not done yet. We'll go for a quick break. One man has been fired, and guess what? An African player will be celebrating not just one, but about 2 or 3 of them who would likely believe in the club will be joining. We'll talk about that story. And the Nigerian boxer also did pretty well this past weekend. Olive is excited because he's not just a fine boy in face. He actually proved that he's a fine boy on the canvas.
I'm excited because we talked about it and we said we're wishing him the best. We're wishing him the best because he's a Nigerian. And
he's an African.
He's an African. And also because he has had a lot of hits, when it comes to certain big matches. So it was a big deal that, okay, you know what, it'd be nice for him to win this. So great news for him. And for all of us female and male folks in Africa.
Yeah.